To Tunisia now and the continuing protests over the high rates of unemployment. There have been violent clashes in several provincial towns. At least 14 people have been killed. The army has been deployed in some of the worst affected areas. Now the government has announced the closure of all schools and universities until further notice, and urgent measures, it says, to create more jobs. Will that be enough to deal with the unrest? Arezki Daoud is the editor of the North Africa Journal.
Not at all. I think they're essentially a short-term reaction, perhaps even knee-jerk reaction that you would expect in a situation that's getting out of control. Similar things we've seen in Algeria, where essentially, as a parallel, if you will, the government essentially postponed football matches just to avoid, again, an escalation. But clearly, what you see in Tunisia is also very much a short-term reaction, as you see in Algeria, where they reduced the price of food to at least give something to the rioters as we speak.
The president is talking about all this in terms of, he described this as terrorist acts. Is that the sort of argument which is going to cut a lot of ice with some of the people on the streets of Tunisian towns?
I think you have to expect that kind of narrative, or at least rhetoric, from a government that really hasn't been in touch with the population for a long time, or maybe even forever. They really can't blame themselves now, and that's the issue that they're going to be facing going forward. Is really, how do you sit down and start talk about the truth in terms of how that country is managed, and in fact most Arab countries in general. So not quite a surprise that they're talking about terrorism involvement or agitators. They have to blame someone, and yet I think most people, certainly observers and analysts, don't buy that.
It's a government which, it's an authoritarian government. It doesn't tolerate any acts of dissent, whatever they may be. How much of a challenge, how big a challenge is it facing?
I think they're facing a substantial challenge insofar as the magnitude of those demonstrations and dissent is unlike anything we've seen in the past. So for the Ben Ali government and the Tunisian administration and government in general, I think the next several years are going to be very challenging in terms of recalibrating their position, in terms of social policy, economic policy, and really begin to talk about political reform. This is going to be, again, certainly a touch and go event for them, just simply by the fact that they really haven't had, experiences in the past with these types of demonstrations and events. And there's going to be a big learning curve in terms of what to do next.
Authoritarian governments tend to press ahead with whatever they're doing, regardless of what anyone else may be saying. We've heard the European Union calling for restraint at the moment in Tunisia. Now, given that the EU is Tunisia's biggest trading partner, is there perhaps a little bit of leverage there?
Well, I think the Tunisian government will listen to the grievances, or at least the complaints, of the Europeans and the Americans. But given that Europe has its own issues, the U.S. has its own problems, both domestically and on the global scene, I think the governments in North Africa tend to look at the Europeans and the Americans and say, well, there's not much they can do. In fact, they're even looking perhaps at what's happening in a place as far away as Côte d'Ivoire, where it's been very difficult to unseat or remove someone that hasn't been elected, let alone trying to influence the political trajectory of these countries in North Africa. So I think, yes, they will listen. They will make promises. The question is, will they fulfill those promises? It remains to be seen. It will be definitely something that civil societies in those countries will have to chime in and take part to.
Looking at the situation in Tunisia, that was Arezki Daoud, editor of the North Africa Journal.
With 3:25 GMT, listening to The World Today from the BBC World Service.